Good day. Before I proceed with this video, just a quick reminder that if you're watching any of our videos by the Duran or Alexander Mercouris or Alex Christoforou on Rumble, if you go to the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button. If you press that red maroon button, that will take you straight to our locals homepage, where you can join our locals community, become, if you choose, an active member. And of course, if you do become an active member of our community on locals, you can then start to publish exclusive content and also participate in my Wednesday live streams. Well, today's video, as all the other videos now for several weeks, will be focused on the crisis in Ukraine. I say that with some degree of apology, especially if you live outside the West and Russia, because obviously this isn't the only event that's taking place in the world. But at the moment, it's the event around which all other issues in the world are being organized, and for that reason I will primarily focus upon it. And we've had a fair amount of news over the last 24 hours from the battlefields. Now, firstly, I've received news, there's been news that in Mariupol itself, this is this port city on the Sea of Azov, which has been the major point of the conflict at the moment, that in Mariupol itself, organized resistance by the Ukrainian military in most of the city has apparently completely broken down. Apparently, there are still isolated groups of Ukrainian fighters trying to resist the various forces of the Russian army, the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic, and the Chechen irregular forces that are now steadily clearing the city. But organized resistance in the city itself, in its residential regions, seems to have essentially collapsed. It seems that the forces of the Donetsk People's Republic have now occupied the major administrative buildings of the city. The mayor, the Ukrainian mayor of the city, apparently has left, and before very long, I suspect the residential areas will be cleared entirely of Ukrainian troops, at which point, no doubt, the Russians will announce that the city has indeed fallen under the control of the Donetsk People's Republic. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry essentially admitted the truth earlier today, when it also confirmed that the Russians have now in effect established a land bridge between the Donetsk People's Republic and Crimea. In other words, that they're in control of all of Kherson region, most of Zaporozhye region, or most 54% of Donetsk region, but certainly all of the coastline. And that means that they're in effect in a position to control all the sea all the way up to Crimea. And that has been achieved through what has been the largely completed pacification of Mariupol. I understand that the only point of organized resistance by the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol is the giant Azov-style steelworks, which is apparently where some of the troops of the far-right battalion, which I'm not going to name, where some of those troops are now located. I suspect that those troops will rapidly be surrounded, and if a decision is taken to not to storm the steelworks, which might cause an awful lot of very severe fighting and heavy loss of life, it will probably be the case that the Russians will decide that bottling up these troops in that steelworks means that in time they can be starved out. Well, that's my assessment of the situation in Mariupol based on the information that I'm getting. Elsewhere in Donbass, which, as we will see, is still very much the central area of the fighting, I understand that Russian troops are now moving steadily south from the city of Izium, which they cleared some days ago, and they're moving south, closing the vice around the remaining Ukrainian troops in the Donetsk region, which were located opposite the capital city of Donetsk region, which is Donetsk city, which has of course always been under militia control. And I also understand that the Ukrainian forces around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk also remain essentially encircled. Now, as I discussed in my previous video, there's a great deal of mystery as to the exact number of these forces, but there is no dispute that they consist of the better troops, the best organized and best trained troops of the Ukrainian military. And it's clear that they are being steadily encircled and defeated. Now, I would also add that over the last 24 hours, there's been reports of a shift in targets by the Russian Air Force and missile troops. They seem now to be concentrating on attacking fuel dumps and fuel facilities around Ukraine. They destroyed a major fuel dump, fuel storage center near Kiev. And the point here is that these places, these fuel storage centers, were providing the fuel for the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine. So the intention apparently is to try to starve these troops of fuel, presumably with the intention of preventing them now from carrying out a proper retreat, thereby making their total encirclement ultimately easier. So it does seem to me as if the Russians now are essentially closing in on these troops in Donbass, and that this is the disaster, this is the end of that Ukrainian force in Donbass, which has been all along the center of Russian strategic priorities. Now, very interestingly, we've had a discussion of Russian intentions, and it's been provided by a senior official of the Russian Defense Ministry. And I'm going to read out the entire report from Interfax, and then I'm going to comment on some of the things that the Western media has been saying about these comments. And the person, the military official, is General Sergei Rudskoy. And this is what Interfax reports him as having said. The main objectives of the first stage of the operation in Ukraine have been accomplished. Russian General Staff Main Operational Directorate Head Sergei Rudskoy said. The main stage objectives of the first stage of the operation have generally been accomplished. The combat potential of the armed forces of Ukraine has been consistently reduced, which I emphasize once again makes it possible to focus on the main effort to achieve the main goal, liberation of Donbass. Units of the Lugansk People's Republic militia have liberated 93% of the Republic's territory. That means Lugansk region. Fighting is now taking place on the approaches to Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. The People's Militia of the Donetsk People's Republic have taken control of 54% of their territory. The liberation of Mariupol continues. Units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, jointly with the People's Militia of the Donetsk People's Republic, are conducting an offensive to liberate populated areas west of Donetsk. The storming of Ukrainian cities blocked by Russian troops is possible, but the main objective is the complete liberation of Donbass. We did not plan to storm them initially in order to avoid destruction and minimize losses among personnel and civilians. Although we are not ruling out such a possibility, our forces and equipment will focus on the most important thing, the complete liberation of Donbass. in due course, following the implementation of the set objectives by specific combat groups, and they're being implemented successfully. We did not relegate military support to the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics only within their borders due to the threat of constant replenishment of Ukrainian military groups. There were two options. The first one was to limit the actions only to the territory of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics within the administrative borders of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, which is stated in the Republic's constitutions. But then we would have been faced with constant replenishment by the Ukrainian authorities of the group involved in the so-called Joint Forces operation. That's the Ukrainian army, the name of the Ukrainian army in Donbass. Therefore, the second option was chosen, which envisages actions on the entire territory of Ukraine with events for its demilitarization and denazification. The progress of the operation confirmed that this decision was the right one. It is being conducted by the General Staff in strict accordance with the approved plan. Now, there have been some reports in the Western media that this announcement by Rudskoy that the priority of the Russian military is Donbass and that they were not seeking to storm Ukrainian cities outside the Donbass, and that their objective was to defeat the Ukrainian armies in Donbass, that this somehow represents a scaling down of Russian objectives. Well, if you've been following this channel, you will know that this is simply not the case. But don't take it from me. This is what Vladimir Putin said some weeks ago at a meeting with airline staff in the Kremlin. He said this on the 5th of March. And as you will see, it's very, very close to what the situation, what is being described by General Rudskoy. He said that he said the following when discussing the operation. Speaking of the operation itself, I know that there are many speculations about it. Frankly, I have no time to get into that, but the report to me that there is much chit-chat about what is going on. All analysts are seeing what is happening, so I will not reveal any secret to you. We could have acted in a variety of ways. We could simply help the republics of Donbass right on the line of contact, at the front line, so to say, and simply reinforce them with our army. But in this case, the other side, I mean reckless support for nationalists and radicals coming from the West, would have provided endless support with the material resources, ammunition, equipment, and so on. Therefore, our General Staff and the Defence Ministry took a different road. The first thing they did was to destroy all the military infrastructure, not completely, but most of it, arms and ammunition depots, aircraft and air defense systems. Destroying enemy air defense systems takes some time. Sometime they must be identified and then hit. This work has been practically finished. However, the demand to impose a no-fly zone, hence the demand to impose a no-fly zone. However, this is why we chose this road, and it turned out to be absolutely correct. Our servicemen are working without haste and are doing everything to ensure the safety of civilians. And then he goes on to discuss the operation as it was, and this was on the March the 5th. But you see that Putin on the March the 5th confirms, or rather already said, what Rudskoy is saying now, that the operation has always been focused on Donbass, but the Russian military advised the political leadership that if they restricted their operations to Donbass, if they didn't extend them beyond Donbass, then the risk was that the Russians would find themselves in a constant battle with endlessly reinforced Ukrainian forces in Donbass, and therefore the decision was taken to step outside Donbass, limit the ability of the Ukrainians to reinforce their forces in Donbass by pinning troops down in places like Kiev, Kharkiv, Nikolaev, Odessa, and the rest, so as to isolate the Ukrainian forces in Donbass and defeat them in detail. There is no difference between what Rudskoy is saying now and what Putin was saying on the 5th of March. Now, to return to what Rudskoy said, he actually said an awful lot more. He said Ukraine's air forces and air defense system are now destroyed almost entirely. The country's navy has ceased to exist. The demilitarization of Ukraine is being achieved both with precision strikes on military infrastructure, military bases, aerodromes, command posts, arsenals, and military depots, and with troops crushing the opposing enemy groups. Some NATO states suggest closing the airspace over Ukraine. The armed forces of the Russian Federation will immediately react to any such attempts appropriately. Now, I would say also that people in the West, commentators in the West, have said that Rudskoy seemed to be scaling back from plans, Russian plans, to storm Ukrainian cities. As I have again argued, discussed many times in many programs on this channel, it's absolutely clear that the Russians were never focused on storming Ukrainian cities like Kiev and Kharkiv and Nikolaev and Chernigov and Sumy. The objective always was to pin Ukrainian troops down there. But it's important to say that Rudskoy is now leaving the option of storming those cities, of taking those cities open. He said, we do not plan to storm them initially in order to avoid destruction and minimize losses among personnel and civilians, although we are not ruling out such a possibility. So that wasn't the original plan to storm these cities. But if Ukraine's resistance continues, if they don't come to terms, the kind of terms that the Russians are insisting upon, in other words, if they don't agree to neutrality, demilitarization, what the Russians refer to as denazification, and if they won't recognize the independence of the Donbass and Crimea's unification with Russia, then in that case, the policy might change, and eventually we might start to see Russian troops entering cities like Sumy, Chernigov, Kharkiv, and perhaps eventually even Kiev. So what some people in the West are reporting as a softening of Russian positions, when analyzed properly, is actually a hardening of them. And note carefully that Rudskoy spoke about the main objectives of the first stage of the operation having been generally accomplished, which begs the question of what the second and third and fourth and other stages of this operation might be. So the first stage might have been focused on Donbass. Perhaps future stages will go wider than that. Now, Rudskoy also provided some information about Russian troop losses. He said, unfortunately, during the special military operation, there have been losses amongst our comrades. 1,351 servicemen are dead and 3,825 injured. Now, I believe these figures, the Western governments and the Ukrainians have been giving wildly improbable and absurd figures ranging up to 30,000 casualties, including 15,000 dead. I've never taken any of those claims seriously. These Russian figures seem to me to be reasonably reliable. I understand that Rutskoy also gave figures for Ukrainian casualties. Apparently he said or claimed that the Ukrainians had suffered as many as 14,000 dead. I have to say I haven't seen that anywhere, and I'm not going to comment on that claim unless I'm absolutely sure that it has been made. But for the record, I think that this figure of 1,351 dead soldiers that the Russians have suffered is probably about right. Anyway, that seems to me to be a fair summary of the general state of the actual military conflict. Mariupol, largely cleared, probably about to fall. Some militants holding out some, brave souls from the, brave souls, some people, if you like, some hardline people from the far-right battalion clinging on in the Azovstal steelworks, but elsewhere in the city, resistance having essentially broken down. And elsewhere in Donbass, the Ukrainian army, largely paralyzed, increasingly in retreat on multiple fronts and facing encirclement even as its fuel supplies are targeted and are perhaps running out. Now, of course, these are the military developments. We've also had a whole succession of meetings in Brussels, attended by Western leaders, including President Biden of the United States. And there was a meeting by NATO, and there was a meeting of the European Union. And what struck me about both of these meetings is that nothing actually of any substance came out of either of them. It's clear that there's been much discussion and debate within NATO about sending NATO troops or troops from some NATO country into Ukraine. But wiser counsels have thankfully prevailed, and apparently that option is not being pursued. And so far, there's no information about any further sanctions on Russia, and it doesn't seem that there will be any substantive sanctions on Russia announced as a result of these meetings, over and above and beyond those sanctions which have already been announced. The German government has been talking about reducing dependence on Russian natural gas and energy by half by the end of this, by midpoint this year. What it actually seems to be doing, what the Germans actually seem to be doing, is buying more and more Russian gas, probably at ever higher prices, in a desperate bid to fill their underground reserves before the winter comes, in the hope or expectation that by that point they'll be able to get more liquefied natural gas from the United States and Qatar. Well, Qatar has now issued a statement that it's not in a position to replace Russian natural gas supplies, and that this is actually impossible. It's actually said that, in fact, energy policy should be separated from politics. Now, this comes a couple of days after the German economics minister, Robert Habeck, went to Qatar, met with Qatari officials, and came away pretending that he'd gained from Qatar some long-term commitment to provide Germany with more liquefied natural gas. I said at the time that this was obviously not true, and the Qataris have in effect admitted it, have agreed to it, have confirmed it. So there's not going to be a huge flood of LNG from Qatar. The United States has said that it will increase supplies of LNG to Europe. But at the moment, given that production in the United States is apparently running at maximal levels based on existing capacity, it's going to be very difficult, it seems to me, to do that without diverting US LNG from Asian suppliers. Now, what that inevitably is going to mean is that LNG prices worldwide are going to spike. Those countries, specifically China, which get pipeline gas from Russia, are going to be getting cheaper gas, but everybody else, including Germany, is going to get more expensive gas. And this doesn't even take into account what the Russians might do, because I'm starting to wonder whether Putin's comment that Russia is shortly going to start demanding payment of the natural gas it supplies to Europe in rubles, whether that isn't a first step by Russia in cutting off natural gas supplies to Europe. The Europeans are saying that they will not pay for Russian natural gas with rubles. If they stick to that, and if the Russians do indeed insist on the position that they're not going to supply natural gas to Europe unless they are paid in rubles, then presumably in about a week's time, Russian supplies of natural gas to Europe will completely stop. I don't know what happens then. It seems to me that at that point, European gas storage facilities will still be largely empty. We're only just a few weeks away from winter after all. Some of that gas will have to be used over the summer. If the Europeans stick to their present position of not paying for it in rubles, then presumably natural gas will quickly run out. And as I've said already, there just isn't enough LNG being produced by the United States to make the difference. And Qatar has also confirmed as much. So we will see what happens and what's going on there. But it does seem to me as if we're now in a game of bluff and counter bluff. And it will be interesting to see whose bluff gets called first. Overall, I have to say that this whole affair once again reminds me of this catastrophic failure in Western diplomatic strategy, which has brought us to this point of utter crisis. Let us go back again just 6 weeks to mid-February, before the conflict had heated up, before the fighting began. At that point, the Russians were basically demanding two things: a written commitment from the West that Ukraine would not join NATO, and secondly, commitments from the West that there would not be any further eastward expansion of NATO, and that the Minsk agreement, which was supposed to provide the pathway to a settlement of the Ukrainian conflict, would be fully implemented as a result of direct talks between the Ukrainians and the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And as I repeatedly said in program after program, given that there was never any real plan that Ukraine would ever join NATO, and given that the Western powers all said that they supported the Minsk agreement, it seemed to me that the Russian demands were not only reasonable, but ones that could be accepted or agreed to without any real sign of Western capitulation. Instead, what we got was the Western powers digging in their heels, refusing to discuss the eastward expansion of NATO. We have those extraordinary words by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg saying that the Russians had no right to veto, no right to state a view about NATO's eastward expansion. This is only a matter for NATO to decide. And at the same time, the Western powers did absolutely nothing to get the Ukrainians to sit down and to negotiate upon the basis of the Minsk agreement. There was in fact a disastrous meeting of the political advisors of Ukraine, of the presidents of Ukraine and Russia, and of the president of France and the chancellor of Germany in Berlin in February, which went nowhere when Ukraine again refused to do what the Minsk agreement specified, which was sit down and negotiate with the representatives of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and the French and the Germans just sat there nodding and apparently doing nothing. So think of that situation. Think how different things would be now if the Western powers had acted differently. We would have avoided a war. Ukraine would not have been devastated in the way that it has been. The IMF says that only around a third of Ukraine's economy is still functioning. Millions of people have been displaced from their homes. Thousands of people have been killed. Tens of thousands have been injured. And of course, the West has embarked upon a sanctions war, which is now firing up even further global inflation, which is threatening the world with food and energy shortages. It seems to me that the price we are all paying for a mule-headed refusal to negotiate upon terms that, frankly speaking, were perfectly reasonable when looked at objectively, that this price that we're all paying is exorbitantly high. Well, I'm afraid we can't go back in time, and we can't now return to the situation that we were in mid-February. The Russians have clearly lost patience, and they will continue their war in Ukraine, certainly until Donbass is fully cleared of the Ukrainians. And if the Ukrainians don't finally acknowledge its independence, well, General Rutskoy is now floating the possibility that the Russian military might start taking action to storm Ukrainian cities. The mayor of the important Ukrainian city of Chernigov has now admitted that his city is completely surrounded by the Russian military and is completely cut off obviously also from resupply. So the Russians could presumably move to storm it in the same way that they have just been doing in Mariupol. I hope with less devastation, but who knows. So it's extraordinary looking back how we've landed ourselves in this situation, in a situation where there's going to be global inflation, where people are going to die in Ukraine, where millions have been displaced, where thousands have been injured, and where, importantly, there is also a major rearrangement of the global geometry. Because clearly China and Russia, the extent to which the two countries are now working in unison has become even clearer, to the extent that it has dismayed the Western powers. And of course, at the same time, we see India now moving to adjust its positions. India is apparently moving forward with a plan to buy Russian oil on the basis of a rupee payments, moving away, in other words, from the Western dollar, from the US dollar. And I've been reading articles in the Chinese media which suggest that the Chinese are willing to fill any gaps the Russians may experience in terms of semiconductors, which of course is the high technology item that supposedly the Russians lack. Though I have to say I'm rather skeptical of the idea that the Russians do not have a semiconductor industry. I'm aware that there have been claims that that is the case, but I think that people are actually not looking at the Russian semiconductor industry holistically, and that they don't fully appreciate that a large part of it functions just below the surface, providing semiconductors for the Russian military, about which we know very little. And I would add that Sergei Lavrov is now heading to Beijing on the 31st of March, and this comes after a very successful meeting between the Chinese and Indian foreign ministers, in which they confirmed a community of view on the question of Ukraine, an identity of view between China and India, which basically positions both as friendly to Russia and arguably as friendlier towards each other. So it seems to me that, looked at objectively, this is turning into a disastrous debacle. Ukraine is being progressively destroyed. Ukraine's best army is now rapidly hurtling towards encirclement. Western economies are going to be plagued by massive inflation and a probable recession. Russia also, of course, will also suffer a recession. The big winners, China and India, China especially, are scooping up all the winnings. And all because the Western powers refused to admit that which they privately were agreeing with amongst each other, that Ukraine would never join NATO, and refused to support the full implementation of the Minsk agreement, even though that was something which they had always publicly committed themselves to do. If this isn't a catastrophic failure of Western policy, I don't know what is. And I suspect that future generations will not look sympathetically back at the Western leaders who have led us into this debacle. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check us out on our other platforms. I've already mentioned Rumble and Locals, but you can also find us on multiple other platforms also. And of course, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the things you will find there. And please also, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon as events develop. President Biden is heading to Poland. He might even be there as we speak. I expect more florid rhetoric from him of support for Poland in this crisis, and of course, obviously, support for Ukraine. Be interesting to see if he meets President Zelensky. There's lots of rumors, which I cannot confirm, and don't put much weight in, by the way, that he's actually in Poland. Well, we'll see. And one way or the other, we'll see what President Biden says. But personally, I think that the point or the moment when there was a real possibility of a NATO intervention force or even a Polish intervention force being sent into Western Ukraine has passed. One way or the other, I will anyway endeavour to keep you informed, at least of my opinions of this complex conflict. And thank you again for joining me today.